repeat it. So, like I said, states have taken different approaches to implementing the weapons of mass destruction treaties. These, of course, include the Biological Weapons Convention from 1972, the Chemical Weapons Convention from 1993, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, of course, there was just a review conference which finished last week. And in this regime, we can, of course, include Resolution 1540, which was adopted in 2004. And in fact, just before I left the committee at the end of June, there were open consultations underway in New York to review the implementation of Resolution 1540 since 2016. A report on that process is underway, so-called Comprehensive Review Report. And in principle, there will be a new Security Council resolution for Resolution 1540 by late November, but we will see. I don't know what's going to happen, but that's what's happened so far with Resolution 1540. But 1540, of course, is a Chapter 7 resolution. It requires states to implement a number of measures. Strategic trade control is one of them. Well, really dual use goods control, to tie into our previous discussion. Under operative paragraphs 3C and D of the resolution. But Resolution 1540 also requires states to have prohibitions in place regarding biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons and related materials. It also requires states to have measures in place for accounting for materials and securing them. So in other words, can you keep track of what scheduled chemicals are being imported or exported from Vietnam, and who's using them and so on. The same with biological materials, that is highly pathogenic agents, toxins, as well as nuclear material. And interestingly, Resolution 1540 covers activities that the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty do not cover, such as transport. So it complements these resolutions, these treaties. It is not intended to somehow replace them. It complements them. But to be very clear, my role here is not as a 1540 expert. It is here to talk to you about how you can work on the activities on the roadmap and to see a way forward looking at how other countries have done it. Some other, and this came up in Mr. Young's presentation, what other treaties Vietnam has acceded to or ratified. These include the Nuclear Terrorism Treaty, the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material Convention, which was amended in 2005, the Geneva Protocol, which prevents the use in war of biological weapons and gas weapons also, the Terrorism Bombing Conventions and Financing of Terrorism Convention. Also, these haven't been mentioned yet, but there are various conventions regarding the safety of maritime navigation and fixed platforms. And interestingly, those protocols specifically mention weapons of mass destruction, as does the Beijing Convention on Civil Aviation. So all of this is relevant to the WMD treaty regime. What makes implementing this complicated is from the implementer side, just to give one example, the OPCW can only focus on Chemical Weapons Convention. IAEA can help you with the Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Material. But it's very difficult, of course, for states to coordinate with implementing agencies all of these different conventions. And I think that's something to bear in mind here today and tomorrow. And as already pointed out, these are the treaties that Vietnam has joined, including, of course, the Bangkok Treaty on the Asia nuclear-free zone in 1996. Okay, So to get to the meat of this presentation, again, I will discuss 3 countries' approaches to WMD treaty implementation: South Africa, India, and Australia. Just to warn you, it's really dense. It's very dense. It's something only a lawyer could love. And I hope the translation behind me will help you. You have access to this later, and you can just feel free to ask me questions, but it is very, very dense. But let's see if we can plow through this together. Okay, so South Africa. They adopted their so-called Weapons of Mass Destruction Non-Proliferation Act in 1993. So long before 1540. I would imagine that this was somewhat inspired by their adoption of the Chemical Weapons Convention Act, or joining that treaty, but I don't know the background to that, but it is an old law. It has been amended subsequently 2 times, as you can see, and the copy that you have is the consolidated version. So it has the amendments. It was also amended by the Nuclear Energy Act and the so-called Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terrorist and Related Activities Act. They also call that the PCD-TRA or something like that. They have an acronym for it. It is a mouthful. And interestingly, that last law, that's where they have their proliferation financing measures. It's not in their Weapons of Mass Destruction Act, and nor is it in a notice under their Weapons of Mass Destruction Act. And I know that's important because we've been talking about proliferation financing already. Some key definitions. This is interesting. They have one for biological warfare agent and one for chemical warfare agent. Many states will use the definitions that are found in the Chemical Weapons Convention, in, for example, Article 2, or in the Biological Weapons Convention, Article 1. But in the case of South Africa, they have slightly different definitions, which are not strictly speaking based on the definitions in the convention. That's fine. It suits their purposes, and they've been able to enforce that. But as we'll see, they did decide later, and we'll see this later in one of their notices on the Biological Weapons Convention, to add the definition from the convention. But anyway, these are the definitions in their Non-Proliferation Act. They also include a definition for delivery systems. And of course, 1540, for example, specifically mentions delivery systems. South Africa already had that in there in 1993. And here they mention dual purpose capabilities. So Mike already spoke to this, and you also, of course, have already included this in Decree 81. These are capabilities, so technologies, materials, and so on, that can be used for both peaceful purposes. This applies across chemical, nuclear, and biological, but it can also be used for harmful purposes. And that's the whole point of our work here, is to keep these dangerous materials, which have peaceful purposes, out of bad actors' hands. That's really what this is all about, isn't it? Export, they have a definition for export in their legislation. They also have one for re-export, so materials coming into South Africa that then leave again, as well as technology. I'm going to get some water. Excuse me. Technology, by the way, is very interesting, and it's also super important, and it's quite interesting that they already had that so long ago in their legislation. But technology is increasingly important. There's a lot of discussion about emerging technology, synthetic biology, micro facilities for chemicals, artificial intelligence, the digitalization of biology. There is so much going on that technology has taken on a whole new meaning. And already they had this in their legislation. They've included a definition for transit. So this is material that's coming into South Africa, but that doesn't stay there. It leaves their port. And just yesterday, as we were coming from Hanoi to Halong, we saw a large port, and we were all very excited to see this, of course. But it would seem to me that for Vietnam and for many countries with sizable ports, transit is an extremely important issue. And for a lot of countries, the notion of transit is sometimes not in legislation, but it should be, because it's an extremely important notion. And of course, Jay and Mike know a lot about this, of course, as well. Finally, they have a definition for WMD, and they specifically mention that WMD are those weapons that are designed to kill, harm, or infect people. And importantly, they included animals or plants. It's not just about people, because of course, any of these can do enormous harm on animals and plants and destroy a country's agricultural sector. And for a country like South Africa with a large agricultural sector, this is extremely important. And just to show you how complicated things get, FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, they're involved with this to some extent because of the impacts on animals and plants. So is the World Organization for Animal Health. They actually have a program focused on biothreats. So there are so many different agencies involved with what we're doing that don't even occur to us somehow. Anyhow, just to emphasize here that South Africa already saw the importance of having this in their legislation. And of course, they highlight what those effects are: nuclear explosions, the effects of chemical warfare agents on our bodies or on animals or plants, and of course, biological warfare agents and the effects that they can have. So in this law, under Section 2, they have a policy making measure. And as you'll see here, they have authorized the Minister of Trade and Industry, and of course, this is deputized by the minister, but to adopt preventive measures, to emphasize free trade. So they were already thinking about, we don't want to impede free trade by having these measures in place. The prohibitions. So fast forward to 2004 with Resolution 1540, they have a policy measure in place for the adoption of prohibitions, control over use in strategic trade, as well as activities that are permitted. They wanted to make it very clear that, again, certain dual-use materials have permitted activities. And this is highlighted in the Biological Weapons Convention, the NPT, and the Chemical Weapons Convention, that you can do these things. You can have defensive military uses. You can have agricultural activities using some of these materials. They also established a council, and my dear friend Melanie Rediar works for that council. It still exists, so it's been there now for 30 years. And it has a secretariat, which is part of the International Trade and Economic Development Division in the Department of Trade and Competition. This is their new name. And it has members from, just like here, it's interministerial. So trade and industry, international relations and cooperation, defense, nuclear energy, the Corporation for Nuclear Energy, Mineral Resources and Energy, and their state security agency. This is how they have set up their council, and they have input from industry. And hopefully this will perhaps come up in a later presentation on outreach to inter alia industry. They had this already in 1993, and this included outreach to the chemicals industry, laboratories working with highly pathogenic agents, their nuclear sector. South Africa does have a nuclear power plant, so they do have nuclear energy, and their aerospace industry. And there's the website, so you can actually take a look and see what they're up to. The functions, I think some of this will look very familiar to you. Managing activities related to non-proliferation, but also providing guidance, the awareness raising role of the council, implementing their convention requirements. So this includes 1540, but also CWC, BWC, NPT, and so on. Extremely important, intra-governmental cooperation And this, for me, having worked, I've been doing this for 20 years. That is one of the biggest challenges for governments is governmental cooperation. But I think here we're seeing that a lot. And I had seen that when I was working with Vietnam a few years ago. It's extremely important. And cooperation with industry, because it's industry, it's the laboratories, it's the chemicals facilities, it's the research facilities with nuclear material that will be responsible for implementing, well, at the moment, Decree 81, and if there is new legislation, implementing that legislation and the decrees issued under that legislation. The Minister of Trade and Industry can declare goods to be controlled goods. And I'll talk about that a lot more, because controlled goods, in the case of South Africa, it's not just for strategic trade control, it's also for domestic activities, including manufacture. So I will go into some detail on that. Permits, and also registration. And now they have an online process for that. It's new, just within the last year. So I'll talk about that as well. As you'll see, I skip sections. I don't go section by section to spare us all, but and some of it you can take a look at it for yourself. But skipping to 12, this is what inspectors can do. They have an inspections regime. They can go into premises where controlled goods are kept. So for example, they can go into a laboratory that has highly pathogenic agents that have been declared to be controlled goods. So they have that inspection capability. They can investigate. They can also look to see if a facility with a permit is complying with a permit. And then they have various modalities for the inspections, soak sampling, taking measurements, and so on. This is a key section, section 13. This in their act. This enables the minister, as the Minister of Trade and Industry, as recommended by the WMD Council, to declare goods to be controlled goods. There's a notice that they have issued under this act. They call them government notices. The notice specifies what happens when a good has been declared a controlled good. It triggers a series of actions, things that have to be done, including registration, permits in some cases, but not always, end user certificates, and so on. It's an extremely important section. That section also can prohibit the import, export, re-export, or transit of controlled goods or require a permit. So it actually, it can prohibit certain goods, subject them to end-use requirements. And also, here's this last important point, and this came up yesterday, whether some countries require, for example, a permitting process for manufacture of certain kinds of goods. Yes, and South Africa does this through a permit procedure. And these are the sorts of things that they can require a permit for: manufacture, procurement, use, operations, stockpiling, so just storing it, maintenance, transport, or disposal. And disposal this is also extremely interesting, because disposal leads to waste management issues. Disposal leads to waste management issues, which again, a lot of countries don't. My computer is talking to me. Waste management issues are tied to disposal, because South Africa and a lot of African countries in particular are thinking about how to deal with waste, waste from highly pathogenic agents, nuclear material, and chemicals. And South Africa was already thinking about that. So other things that are required under their law, if you have controlled goods and you have them in your possession, and again, there are notices that tell people exactly how to do this, people or entities, you have to register and then make different kinds of declarations. And it depends on the kind of material. So I'll go into more detail on that later. Yeah, this is the registration system. That's an amendment, by the way. And it clearly points out that this is one of the first notices that I want to talk to you about, notice R16. This came out 12 years ago. It's still valid. Persons who are in control of activities. So that could be, again, stockpiling, use, procurement. I had just mentioned all those activities. With regard to controlled goods, or if they have them in their possession, they have to register. There's no choice in the matter. You have to register, and you go through this online registration system. So, for example, and I'll just take one off the top of my head, under the Chemical Weapons Convention notice, if you have in your possession a Schedule I chemical, and Schedule I chemicals are the most highly controlled chemicals for the Chemical Weapons Convention purposes. They are essentially chemical weapons. This is saxitoxin, ricin, so on. If you have, and Novichok has been added recently, if you have that in your possession, you have to register. And in the case of Schedule I chemicals, you have to do more, but you have to at least register. And the permits for registered persons, if you're required to have a permit, it's not always the case, but again, according to the notice, you may have to get an individual export or import permit. You might be able to get an open permit, an individual transit permit, a manufacturing and services permit. And this is the one, this is where we sort of veer off a bit from strategic trade control into domestic activities involving manufacturer services, including brokering. You have to get a permit in some cases, depending on the controlled good. And also, but this provisional export guidance, there's not a permit for that. What that means is they want to give you guidance if you ask to determine whether you need a permit or not. And this is, if you'll recall, this is one of the functions of the council, is to provide guidance to individuals who may be working with controlled goods. And here come the notices. Notice 75, still in effect. This is their catch-all. This, of course, is related to trade control. But notice 75 says that if goods are not controlled, or they're controlled, but the specifications of the goods in the notice fall outside, if there's a good and the specifications fall outside what's in the notice, then this catch-all notice will apply. And so in other words, it allows the government to catch, to manage, to seize, if necessary, goods that may be intended for a weapons of mass destruction program and shouldn't be, but they're not in a notice. And so that's their catch-all notice right there. It's extremely important. In 2010, as I already, this is their Chemical Weapons Convention notice. And this is what I was sort of starting to suggest even last evening, that South Africa's legislation is really interesting because it sets the general terms, the Non-Proliferation Act, but then you have these notices and they can just issue them as necessary. They updated this one in 2021. They had an earlier one. This is the most recent one, which I found. It confirms that their council, again, their WMD, Non-Proliferation Council, that's their CWC national authority. Every country does it differently. That's what South Africa has done. In that notice, they also have the prohibitions on chemical weapons activities. These are the Article 7 prohibitions, and they have put these, the Article 2 prohibitions, and they put these into that notice, and they apply to natural persons and legal persons as required under the convention, but they've got that in that notice. They also have in there a permit process, end user certificates, and transfer notice requirements. The permit process in particular is for Schedule I chemicals, because the Chemical Weapons Convention requires facility permits. It's the only requirement for permits or licensing in the Chemical Weapons Convention, but it's so they've put it into this notice. And they have the other requirements required by the Chemical Weapons Convention, including end user certificate. And this applies to, of course, Schedule I chemicals, but also Schedules 2 and 3 chemicals. It also identifies in that notice thresholds at which CWC related goods, namely scheduled chemicals, but also unscheduled discrete organic chemicals, must be notified to the council because it's the council as the national authority that prepares declarations to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. But in that notice, they've got that power to get information from facilities working with scheduled chemicals so that the council can prepare its declarations. Again, an extremely important measure in that notice. Biological materials. Also relatively recent, from 2019. They've identified in that notice certain highly pathogenic agents and toxins and equipment and technology, centrifuges, fermenters, so on, that could be used in a biological weapons program. And so those are, again, controlled goods. Going back to the law, Section 13 gave the minister the power to declare certain things controlled goods. Well, they've done so in that notice. It also has, in the notice, there are prohibitions on biological weapons activities. And this is the notice, by the way, where they update their definition of biological weapon. It's now the definition as found in the convention. It also has, requires permits for export, re-export, transit, and end user certificate requirements, as well as, and this is domestic, notification for transport within South Africa of controlled goods. So in other words, if a laboratory wants to send a sample of botulinum toxin from Pretoria to Cape Town, you have to get a permit for that under this notice. If you don't, you're in violation of the notice. In that notice, they have several annexures. Those annexures include human pathogens, zoonotic pathogens, toxins. So this is, I was very happy to see that they've included toxins, because then they're covering their biological and toxin weapons requirements, animal pathogens, plant pathogens, also GMOs, and certain kinds of equipment. And they have this in the annexures in that notice, and then they refer to those annexures in the other measures. And again, issued under the overall framework law. In April 2021, so just last year, they issued another notice on the missile technology control regime. They are a member of that. It is a voluntary arrangement of several states, but I put it here because it has pertinence in terms of thinking about delivery system components. And in this case, they all of the items under the MTCR are considered controlled goods, all of them. They require end user certificates in certain cases, and for the manufacturer, so for the domestic manufacture of certain missile components, they require a permit because they're controlled goods. They're also a member of the nuclear supplier group. So they have implemented under Notice 319, the NSG Part 2 guidelines, which covers various related equipment, materials, software, and so on. Those are controlled goods, everything under Part 2, and they require permits for export as well as manufacture. And so for South Africa, it was felt for this to be important because this enables them to say to other countries, we require permits for these activities. Therefore, it is safe to invest in South Africa for the manufacture of these things, because these are high value activities. And if you'll recall, one of the council's policy responsibilities was trade, but secure and safe trade, but certainly trade. Other relevant sections in that act, the council can require industry, natural persons, and so on to furnish information. We think that you have some information. We'd like to take a look at it. You know, it came to our attention that there's something in that chemicals facility. We want to learn more about it, please. They can request that. They can ask for samples. They can ask a biological laboratory that has controlled goods in it. We have some, we just want to talk to you. We want to sample X, Y, or Z in your laboratory. Can you please send us a sample to our research lab? We want to take a look at that. They can do that. They can seize and dispose, presumably in cooperation with the police. Either if someone is working with a controlled good without a permit, or if they're in non-compliance with that permit. And they have offenses and penalties under their act. And those offenses and penalties tie into the notices. So if you violate a notice, the act kicks in with the offenses and penalties, and they become prosecutable offenses. So that's South Africa. To me, I have been familiar with their legislation for years. I find it very elegant. It's umbrella under which different notices are issued. I understand it is not a regional country. On the other hand, it is a South-South. We have a sort of a South-South scenario, 2 middle-income countries with advanced industrial bases, with nuclear activities, biological activities, chemicals activities. And so in my view, I thought South Africa, plus it's an omnibus law, I thought it could be an extremely useful example. Mindful again that it's in Africa, and so not in Asia, but nevertheless, I hope that you found this overview helpful. Moving to South Asia, India. This they have a different approach. So let's go through that and see how they do it. They adopted omnibus legislation. Well, actually, maybe I'll stop first and see if there are questions regarding the South African legislation. I think, if you don't mind, I'd like to stop and see if there are questions. I know it was a lot to digest. No. Okay. All right. Then yes, there is a question. Great. Okay. Let me put my device on.
Tôi xin hỏi là thế ông có thể đánh giá rằng là cái hội đồng trong cái bộ luật của Nam Phi này thì là có phần là quy định về hội đồng đúng không? Từ để tôi vào đây. Hội đồng Nam Phi về chống phổ biến vũ khí giảng loạt. Vâng. Vậy thì theo đánh giá nếu như mà về phía Việt Nam ấy, sau khi mà áp dụng mà xây dựng cái bộ luật chống phổ biến vũ khí giảng loạt thì cái cơ quan đầu mối quốc gia Việt Nam này có được đánh giá một cái là tương ứng cái hội đồng không? Theo ý kiến cá nhân của ông ạ. Cái vấn đề thứ hai là tôi cũng rất mong muốn là để chúng ta có thể chuẩn bị được cái tài liệu cho cái việc chúng ta xây dựng cái luật thì chúng tôi cũng rất mong muốn là phía ông có thể chia sẻ những cái bài đánh giá so sánh giữa cái việc áp dụng của luật Nam Phi này, rồi của Ấn Độ này và của Australia. Thì đấy là một cái để sau này chúng tôi làm cái căn cứ thì chúng tôi cũng có thể đưa vào cái tờ trình để khi mà trình tại sao chúng ta phải lựa chọn cái này, tại sao chúng ta không lựa chọn cái kia, và lựa chọn cái này thì nó như thế nào. Và tôi cũng hiểu rằng là đối với các bộ ngành miền Nam ấy thì việc kiểm soát đối với hàng hóa theo các cái công ước quốc tế, ví dụ như là không phổ biến này, rồi là hóa học này, rồi sinh học thì đã có các bộ chuyên ngành quản lý trực tiếp về các vấn đề này. Tuy nhiên thì những cái cụ thể trực tiếp quy định về vấn đề nó liên quan trực tiếp đến vũ khí hủy diệt hàng loạt thì nó lại nằm ở trong cái 81. Thì đấy là cũng để trao đổi để thông tin để cho phía ông hiểu thêm được. Và cũng để mà không đảo lộn cái chức năng của các bộ ngành thì giả sử như tôi suy nghĩ là giả sử cái luật phòng chống vũ khí hủy diệt của Việt Nam được ban hành chẳng hạn, thì cái việc mà cấp phép ấy, hay là kiểm soát thì Việt Nam đã có luật xuất nhập khẩu rồi, luật thương mại rồi. Đấy. Thì tất cả những cái quy định về kiểm soát cái này thì chúng tôi cũng đều có các cái quy trình hết cả rồi. Cái mà cần có đây chính là một cái danh mục được ban hành theo cái luật phòng chống phổ biến vũ khí dường loạt này. Thì có các danh mục này thì các bộ ngành sẽ căn cứ vào cái chức năng của từng bộ ngành để ban hành, có thể là một cái mô hình đấy để ban hành cái việc mà cấp phép cái thủ tục phát sinh hành chính đấy, cái thủ tục trong hoạt động xuất nhập khẩu đấy, để mà kiểm soát các cái loại hàng hóa mà liên quan đến vũ khí dường loạt hoặc là lương dụng. Xin cảm ơn ạ.
Excellent questions. Thank you so much. Whether the council mechanism in South Africa is a model for Vietnam, again, this is the path they chose. It really is for every country to decide how they want to set up their system. South Africa chose a very centralized approach. With that said, conventional weapons and anything conventional falling under Wassenaar, that is not part of the council. That's in Arms Corps, which is a different agency. And also a lot of the work on safeguards under the MPT and their additional protocol, that's handled by their Atomic Energy Agency. So there is a similar situation in that some activities are handled by other agencies. This is perfectly natural, and that's already happening here. What I took away yesterday was that going through this legal assessment process and this law assessment process will be extremely useful because it will be very clear who's doing, oh, it probably is, but you'll again confirm who's doing what and how you would proceed to assign responsibilities based on existing responsibilities, if I understood that correctly. Whether you should set up a system like South Africa's, well, that's not for me to say. That is truly for you to decide. And I mean, in the US case, for example, when it comes to the Chemical Weapons Convention, because of the US's history as a chemical weapons possessor, because it has a huge chemicals industry, the responsibilities are divided across the departments of commerce, state, defense, and so, but that's how the US decided to do it. In Australia, as we'll see, it's in their Department of Foreign Affairs. They have a non-proliferation office. Every country does it differently. In South Africa, they have an umbrella council. Chemical Weapons Convention National Authority is in there. Their focal point for the Biological Weapons Convention is in that council as well. Their 1540 focal point is in that council. That's where because they wanted to centralize it, I think, just for ease of governance. But that is for every country to decide. And far be it from me to say, well, this is how it should be done. Rather, you see the options and then decide what would work best for you based on your national circumstances. Question 2 on document package. Absolutely. What I will do, now that I have a better understanding of what is happening, I will prepare a zip file. I will send it to Van, and I will clearly label the 3 countries with their laws, with their regulations. And if you'll indulge me, I will also send 3 legislation kits. The OPCWs for the Interpreter Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, their initial measures kit, just so you have it. There is also a biological weapons kit developed by me when I was at Interpol. And then finally, I can send you, if you're interested, a nuclear security legislation kit, which was Indonesia's gift basket to the 2014 Nuclear Security Summit. Those 3 models have a lot of what we have been discussing yesterday and today already. So I'll have a separate folder with those, if that's useful. Third question, on the, again, I think this gets back to my answer on the first question, but the different authorities that have already been assigned to different agencies, the different responsibilities, including different agencies license different activities. Going forward, again, this is for Vietnam to decide what works best for you. Perhaps you will decide to maintain existing responsibilities with existing agencies, but you may have, for example, a different reporting structure. I don't know. This will be for you to decide, but it's ultimately up to you. And to be very clear, 1540, Resolution 1540 has already come up. 1540 does not tell countries how to implement these measures, but rather just makes it very clear that they really need to be implemented. And so how, for example, Vietnam wishes to, and I know you already have Chemical Weapons Convention implementing legislation, but how you wish to continue to implement licensing under that, how you wish to require licensing to work with highly pathogenic agents or nuclear material, because of course you have an Atomic Energy Agency as well. How you wish to change that or not is entirely up to you. So again, just providing the options here so that you can see how other countries have done it. This presentation, to be very clear, is not meant to be by any means prescriptive. It is just providing examples of how other countries have done this. And it's not easy. I hope that was useful.
Xin cảm ơn phần trả lời của ông. Và thực ra thì ý của tôi hỏi ông là thì ông có đánh giá thế nào về cái tính tương đồng, ví dụ giả sử như là cái cơ quan đầu mối quốc gia của Việt Nam với cái hội đồng, chứ chúng tôi cũng không có hỏi là Việt Nam nên áp dụng cái mô hình nào. Cũng mong muốn là ông có thể có những cái tài liệu mà liên quan đến cái phần đánh giá của Ủy ban 1540 ấy. Như ông nói rằng cuối năm nay có thể hoàn thành cái bản đánh giá đấy. Và đấy là một cái căn cứ để chúng tôi cũng có thể đưa vào cái tài liệu để trong cái hồ sơ để trình. Đấy là một cái căn cứ. Cái vật thứ hai nữa là cũng có thể mong muốn ông có thể chuyển giao cho chúng tôi thêm về cái phần là những cái khó khăn vướng mắc một cái cơ chế liên ngành ấy. Cơ chế liên ngành của Nam Phi đấy thì họ mấy cái nước này thì họ sẽ vượt qua những cái cơ chế, những cái khó khăn đấy như thế nào. Đối với Việt Nam thì Việt Nam cũng có cái văn bản quy phạm pháp luật quy định về cái tổ chức liên ngành này. Đấy. Xin cảm ơn.
On a review of the focal point in Vietnam, which is laid out in Decree 81, I have not done that analysis. I wasn't asked to, but if that is something that you would like us to do vis-a-vis the South African WMD Council, that is something we can do, but that is not something we have done yet, because we weren't asked to do that. And I personally am always very sensitive to government intra-agency processes, and just want to have a clear request to do these things before I speak publicly about these matters. I certainly am not in a position to opine on that at the moment. What I have done, however, is laid out how South Africa has organized their council to see, so that you can see how they've done that. On the challenges faced by South Africa in implementing this law and its notices, I think there are two ways we can proceed. I've already been thinking about this. One is, in the package, I will include their most recent annual report. They have an annual report And they actually talk about how they went about implementing this law and the notices last year. The most recent one, of course, is for 2021. And I think at some point, if you find this interesting, it could be interesting to hear directly from Melanie Rediar about how she goes about on a day-to-day basis with her team implementing the law and the notices, including their interministerial cooperation. And indeed, we have been asked to speak to another country about the challenges of implementing Resolution 1540, which ties into this, but that's yet another presentation for another day. But there are, and again, it's not the scope of this presentation, but if we have, I hope, the opportunity to meet again, I can certainly speak to that. On documentation related to 1540 for Vietnam, I would direct you to the official documentation on the 1540 committee's website. All of the national matrices for countries as approved by the committee are on the 1540 committee's website. That is the official documentation. And I would be happy to include that in the package. It's what's on the website. It's publicly available information, so I can put that in the package as well. Maybe before I go, before we leave tomorrow to return to Hanoi, we could just go through a list of things that I can provide, that we can provide, that would be useful to you. Come on. I pronounce that correctly. Oh, sure. Yes, sir, please.
Cảm ơn ông về phần chia sẻ về cái kinh nghiệm của Nam Phi và cái cơ cấu của Nam Phi trong phổ biến. Thì tuy nhiên trong phần bối cảnh của Nam Phi, theo tôi được biết, thì Nam Phi là một quốc gia có năng lực hạt nhân rất là tốt và họ hoàn toàn có thể khả năng phát triển vũ khí hạt nhân trước đây. Tuy nhiên họ đã đảo ngược. Thì như vậy, việc ra cái đạo luật phòng chống phổ biến này thì áp lực của Nam Phi trước các tổ chức quốc tế thì nó có cao hoặc là có cái ảnh hưởng gì hay không?
Well, I don't want to get into that discussion. That is a very politically sensitive discussion for South Africa. Let's just say they had a program, they no longer do. In terms of 1540 came well after they dismantled their program. But again, that's just not the scope of my presentation or this overview. But I have a South African colleague on the 1540 committee, or had, I'm no longer with them. And they are very supportive of 1540. And I believe they would argue that what they have done with their Non-Proliferation Act and all of their notices is meeting their 1540 obligations. So that's operative paragraphs 2 on the prohibitions, operative paragraphs 3A and B, measures to account for and secure nuclear, chemical, and biological materials, and operative paragraphs 3C and D on border control. And we heard about border control today, but border control as well as export control.
Cảm ơn ông. Câu hỏi này bởi vì bối cảnh để đưa ra một cái đạo luật thì nó sẽ khá là quan trọng đối với cả mỗi quốc gia. Cảm ơn ông.
That could be. Let's ask Melanie. If we talk to Melanie, but I don't know. But if that's the case, that could be the case. But I don't know. I cannot say definitively. Whatever got them to do it, I think the positive news is they have this robust non-proliferation framework with a solid law and notices. That's how they've done it, and a council. All right, India. Okay, so India's approach is different, and I'm realizing that maybe also with India I might have a couple of questions on India as well, but that's okay. So they adopted a WMD Delivery Systems Act in 2005. Mike brought to my attention that they had passed earlier, it was actually in August, earlier this month, they passed a bill. It's not law yet. It passed their lower house, but it's an amendment to their WMD Act to include proliferation financing. They recognized that they had a gap, and they included that in their, and they will amend their law once it passed the upper house. They also have, so they have this WMD Act, and I'll get into what it does, but they also have a Foreign Trade Development and Regulation Act. And under this, they amended it to include a chapter on control of export of specified goods, services, and technology under the WMD Act. So these two acts for South Africa, excuse me, for India, this is how it's different. They have two acts that work together. And the Foreign Trade Act in particular controls their export control. Okay. Going back to the WMD Act, and I'll be going back and forth a little bit because they interact. It's again, as I said, this was not going to be easy, but let's plow through here. So under Section 3, they have a jurisdictional. They have jurisdiction in there. So the law applies to all persons in India, citizens of India, outside India, and so on. Very importantly, ships, aircraft, or other means that are registered in India. Flag state jurisdiction has become extremely important with goods being interdicted at sea or coming into ports that might have the flag of a different state, and it gets quite complicated, but it is an issue. So I just want to highlight that. Foreigners in India. For many countries, foreigners in India could include a foreigner who has illicit intentions regarding certain kinds of materials. And so jurisdiction over those persons is also extremely important. Also companies. This is, for example, licensed laboratories working with highly pathogenic agents or chemicals facilities. So jurisdiction over companies for the purposes of this law, again, extremely important. Definitions. So India is a bit, they tie their definitions more closely to the respective conventions than South Africa did, although, like I said, South Africa included a definition for biological weapon in its most recent notice. But in the law, India has included a definition of biological weapon tied to Article 1 of the convention, and their chemical weapon definition is tied to the two definitions in the Chemical Weapons Convention, the one for chemical weapon and the definition in the convention for purposes not prohibited. Because a chemical weapon for the purposes of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and ideally for national legislation, is a toxic chemical that's used for purposes that are prohibited. But if you're using toxic chemicals for purposes that are allowed, then it's not a chemical weapon. And so that's what they've included in their law. And then they have an export definition, which is tied to the Foreign Trade Act. Again, that interplay back and forth. They reference fissile material and radioactive material by reference to their Atomic Energy Act. And this gets to a question that came up. What if there is existing legislation? Well, of course, and this is what happened in India. So they still have their Atomic Energy Act, and they reference it in this act because they didn't need to entirely replace the Atomic Energy Act. Rather, they want to synergize, they want to harmonize them. Very important, and this is similar to what you have in your law, the notion of an item that can be dual use, that can be used both for peaceful purposes, but also for weapons of mass destruction program purposes. An item is tied to this notion of relevant activity. So again, it's similar to what many countries have done. South Africa called them controlled goods. India calls them items, but the idea is the same. Non-state actor, an extremely important and interesting. It's interesting that they included this. Presumably they were, this was adopted a year after Resolution 1540 was adopted. Non-state actor is specified in Resolution 1540, and they included a definition in their law. So this is someone engaging in activities not authorized by the state. And if they're doing so without permission from the state, and it involves dual use goods, then they're in violation of India's legislation. So what can be regulated under this law? So the central government can, first of all, like South Africa has done, identify categories of items and relevant activities that they want to regulate. With the focus, as you can see, more on strategic trade control. And under their Foreign Trade Act, as amended, they apply the WMD Act to specified goods or services, and the central government can make rules to control the transfer of those goods. So again, this interplay. And I think this is important for the purpose of this discussion because you're thinking through, okay, we have existing legislation, so how can we harmonize them? 14C of the Foreign Trade Act, this is their catch-all clause. So if something is not listed, but there is a suspicion that it might be used for a weapons of mass destruction program, they have a catch-all clause in their Foreign Trade Act. They have licensing under Section 14D, and they have offenses, tying back to the WMD Act. Going back to the WMD Act, the central government can assign authorities to implement it, and they've done so. And I will talk about a few of the committees they've established to implement the act. And they can also establish a licensing authority and an appellate authority. The appellate authority being an authority that can review license denials. So due process. Now, under Section 8, this is where they have their prohibitions on nuclear weapons activities, nuclear explosive devices activities, transfers of nuclear weapons and devices. Also, they have here their biological and chemical weapons conventions prohibitions, and they include transport. Because as I said before, transport is not in the chemical and biological weapons conventions, but it's in 1540. So they've included it here. And they also prohibit the transfer of missiles for WMD purposes. Transfers to non-state actors or terrorists is prohibited. And they've also prohibited acts of involving fissile or radioactive material to cause death or injury with the purpose of intimidating people or trying to influence the government. This is their terrorism prevention. This is implementing presumably their nuclear terrorism convention requirement here in this act. Prohibitions under sections 11 and 13 for exports of WMD weapons and materials, as well as brokering unless they're authorized, and they have punishments for this. So again, all of the prohibitions are in this WMD Act. If you'll recall, South Africa had some offenses and penalties in their act, but others were found in the notices. They did it a bit differently. This is, I think, very useful for our purposes to talk about some advisory committees that India has established. They have established an advisory committee on weapons of mass destruction and delivery systems. They have one for nuclear. They have one for chemical, biological, and export control. And those advisory committees can advise the not their council, their just lost track here. what do they call their head agency? I got a lot. Yeah, the central government. Thank you. So the advisory committees can advise the central government on how to implement the law and perhaps what rules they might want to issue, rules or decrees or orders under this act. In India, they call them rules. Okay. They can also make recommendations on, and again, here it comes again, harmonization with other legislation. So these advisory committees, let's just take one example, the Advisory Committee on Nuclear Matters, they can advise central government on how to harmonize the WMD Act with the Atomic Energy Act. The same with the Advisory Committee for Chemicals, they can advise the central government on how to harmonize the WMD Act and its implementation with the Chemical Weapons Convention. The Environmental Protection Act, this is for biological agents because there's a rule on biological agents under that act. So again, it's a bit complicated, as like I said, it would be. They can also advise on policy matters and prohibitions. And presumably, those advisory committees also had a role in this new proliferation financing amendment, which just passed the lower house. I don't know which advisory committee it was. Perhaps it was all of them. Okay, so they have various rules. And first I'll talk about their export, transfer, retransfer, and transshipment rules. For those rules, they have various lists. This will not surprise you. For strategic trade control, they start with chemicals, organisms, related materials, equipment, and technology. This is the so-called SCOMET list, which they update. That list is issued under the Foreign Trade Act. Under the Atomic Energy Act, this is where nuclear material and other related materials, equipment, that comes under the Atomic Energy Act. So there was a question from Mr. Young about division of responsibilities. This is how they've done it. They have different ministries that are responsible for the different control lists, the different control lists. So like I said, for the SCOMET list, so this is chemicals, biological materials, that's the Director General of Foreign Trade. And then for materials, equipment, and technology under the Atomic Energy Act, so that's nuclear material and equipment, that's the lead there, the Joint Secretary in the Department of Atomic Energy. That's how they have decided to do it. So they've given responsibility for these lists to different existing authorities. This is different from South Africa, again, where the council is authorized, the council is authorized through the Minister of Trade and Industry to issue the lists. It's a different structure. Now, to make things even a little more complicated, India also has a Chemical Weapons Convention Act. It's still in force. So in that act, again, they have their definitions. They've established their national authority under that act. They have their prohibitions on schedules 1, 2, and 3 activities. They have a registration system, and this includes, by the way, production. So it's not just strategic trade control, it's also domestic production of schedules 2 and 3 chemicals, as well as discrete organic chemicals. And for a lot of countries, just unscheduled discrete organic chemicals is big business, and a lot of countries have them. They have an inspections regime, and they have offenses and penalties. So unlike, again, South Africa, they have a different law to implement their Chemical Weapons Convention requirements. And again, there's an advisory committee under the WMD Act to advise central government on how to harmonize those two pieces of legislation. Are you with me so far? Okay. So that's India. And they don't, by the way, so I did not go into how they govern biological materials. I do want to briefly mention it though. Under their Environment Protection Act, they have rules on microorganisms. It's from 1989. And they also have, that is for domestic use of microorganisms. So to work with, they call them risk levels, to work with different risk levels of microorganisms, you may need a permit domestically. And then separately, they have the SCOMET list for export control purposes. Okay, so India covers both strategic trade control as well as domestic activities, but they're using an older regulation from 1989. On that point, I suspect at the time, this is just an opinion, but I suspect at the time they were not focused on at that time, because very few people were, biosecurity, namely keeping biological agents out of bad actors' hands. I suspect they were more concerned about biosafety, keeping their people safe from their research laboratory people safe from those agents. So if you were working with hemorrhagic fever, then you needed a permit to show that your laboratory met certain biosafety level standards. And their rules on this, they use, like I said, the risk groups, and those risk groups seem to me to be tied to the World Health Organization's risk groups for biosafety in laboratories. So any questions about, and I don't go into the Atomic Energy Act. Again, it's just so much information. I wanted to really try to focus on these WMD acts and how they interplay with other legislation, how they were set up, and so on. Any questions about India's legislation, their framework? Okay. It's coming.
Thank you. Looking at the India example, I mean, thinking about what some of your needs are and what things that could be helpful to you that we've talked about in terms of information for the impact assessments and the other papers and things that you want to, the package that you want to prepare here in Vietnam. I mean, obviously the South America example, I think, is a very good one. What's that? South Africa example. South America has some very good examples too, but the South Africa example that Scott presented on obviously is clearly a very good one. But I think, I think the Indian one is actually very interesting for you as well, if you think about it, because you could take what they're doing, and I think the key to it is that now here, however many, 17 years after they first adopted the WMD Act, they are expanding it to include proliferation financing. Now, I think there's a very, after it's already been connected to their strategic trade control element. So in other words, you could point out that the approach that you want to take with the law on WMD prevention and kind of follow something akin to the South Africa model is a very good way to go. And then you can use India as an example to show that, look, that's what everybody else is, the direction they're heading towards, but they have to do it now by patching it all together. Whereas you can say, we're going to start with that, kind of like South Africa did, and then build down from there. And again, you could show, look, that's what countries want to do. They want to have connectivity between proliferation financing, WMD prevention, and strategic trade control. And you can point to India as a great example, but also then say, look, India is now, again, this is not to be critical of India, it's just their reality. You can just say that we're in a more, in some ways for us, an advantageous position, given that we're starting from this more omnibus approach like South Africa. So that probably save some time and resources.
It's a bit like countries that they never built up a robust fixed line telephoning network. So they went immediately to mobile phones. So, you know, the countries that started early, they had chemical weapons, well, MPT, then BWC, then, and you'll see this with Australia, then CWC, then 1540, and then of course, FATF's emphasis on proliferation financing. And so a lot of countries are playing catch up. Exactly. So yeah, no, point well taken. And I also found very interesting, perhaps for current purposes, the advisory committees that advise the central government on these different activities. Again, I don't know where their proliferation, I don't know which advisory committees were involved with the proliferation financing amendment to their WMD Act. I suspect that all of them had some role, but I don't know.
I have a question for our Vietnamese colleagues here. Is it possible here for a WMD prevention law to reference definitions in the atomic energy law or the chemical law? Is that customary and possible to do, to harmonize the WMD law by referencing other legislation and definitions?
So a yes, maybe a yes. Yeah. Okay. So there's your answer. Yeah. Great. Now this is really, I think, a good discussion. And is everything clear? I just hope I'm not being, it's hard to follow this. Is it clear? Okay. I'll just assume that it's clear. All right. So we shall continue with Australia. So Australia also it's a little tricky, but let's give it a go. And I think what I'm actually finding useful going through this presentation is I'm realizing, and after having listened to you and your interventions, the parts of their systems that could inform your thinking on how to go forward. That's actually one thing that I'm finding useful from this presentation personally, like the advisory committees or the way that South Africa does notices and so on. Okay, so right, Australia. Again, picked it because it does have a WMD Act, but as you'll see, it has a very different purpose than South Africa's or India's. Nevertheless, this was the remit that I was given, and so here we go. However, they also have other legislation, and I wanted to list this because it is kind of a similar situation where you actually already have several laws with different agencies, as well as Decree 81. So Australia has taken the following approach for WMD treaty implementation and 1540 implementation. First, they have a very old act from 1976, still in force. It's their Crimes Biological Weapons Act. But as you'll see, it's just the crimes. It's really simple. It's old. I mean, at the time that there wasn't much more that states thought they had to do to implement the Biological Weapons Convention. But in the nearly 45 years since, of course, that has changed. They also have a Chemical Weapons Prohibition Act, like India. They also belong to a nuclear-free zone treaty for the South Pacific, and they actually, as you'll see, have implemented their safeguards and their additional protocol further to that act. They have a WMD Act, but it's a little deceiving, as we'll see. It's not like South Africa's or India's for that matter. They have a Defense Trade Controls Act, and some familiar territory here. They have a Customs Act. I'm sure our customs agency friends here are thinking, where's the Customs Act in all of this? Well, here it is in Australia's legislation. and they have prohibited exports and imports regulations. So let's take a closer look. I'm sorry I don't have pretty pictures. I was so impressed with your presentation with all the nice pictures. I'm a lawyer, I do text, so I apologize. I'll try to add pictures next time. I just try to be a bit animated myself. I become the bit more of the picture. All right. So the Biological Weapons Act, it implements the prohibitions. That's pretty much it. They do have a forfeit and seizure provision in there if there are activities taking place in violation of the act. So it, in a very simple way, but a very effective way, it implements their basic Biological Weapons Convention treaty requirements. Their Chemical Weapons Convention Act, this is their primary implementing legislation, as was the case for India. And Section 7 includes several definitions, some of which are directly linked, not all of them, but some are directly linked to the convention. In other words, they use the language of the convention, including definitions for schedules 1, 2, and 3 chemicals. Those are the controlled chemicals in the convention and in the annex on chemicals. Unscheduled discrete organic chemicals, for which declarations must be made to the OPCW. And then 8B, where some terms like consumption, processing, and production, they have said, you know what, we'll define this in the regulations. I guess they did not want to include that in their law. I don't know why, but those get defined in their regulations. And I think part of it is, these are terms that they're not necessarily technical. This was a diplomatic exercise. And so they probably thought, you know, we need to do some more thinking on this before we put it in the law. But I don't know the exact history of that. Again, I'm not an Australian lawyer specializing in this law. Section 12, this is the offenses. The prohibitions are in Article 1 of the convention, and under Article 7, they have to be applied to people. So they've done this, and they have very strict penalties, as you can see, life imprisonment. So they mean business. If you use a chemical weapon in Australia, you are facing prison for life. Section 14, forfeiture and seizure of chemical weapons. They also, of course, like all states parties must do, you must file your declarations to the OPCW on an initial as well as an annual basis if your activities cross certain thresholds. They do this through Part 3, and it's a really big chunk of their law, and it clearly lays out how how industry in Australia has to go about submitting information to the national authority so that the national authority can prepare its declarations. And as you'll see, Australia requires permits, and this came up before, domestic activities for producing or dealing with scheduled chemicals above certain quantity thresholds. They also require notifications for activities involving UDOCs, unscheduled discrete organic chemicals, again, above certain thresholds. The reason they do this is they need to know who's carrying out these activities so that they can fulfill their treaty requirement, namely the annual declarations. And I believe in the US, this is done through Commerce. I think it's Commerce who is responsible for this. And then Part 4 of the Act requires record keeping at facilities. Part 5, again, another really big chunk of the law. I did not want to go section by section, so I'm giving you the part. This is where they implement their obligations under the convention for international compliance inspections. So this is industry facility, chemical facility inspections. The OPCW, of course, perhaps they've come here to do inspections. That's where they include their national measures for that, as well as challenge inspections. They do have a national inspections regime to complement the international inspections regime. They also have a measure for facility agreements with the OPCW. They have their, they criminalize activities in sections 77 to 78. So this is if you're using scheduled chemicals, handling scheduled chemicals without a permit or in breach of one, you face criminal sanctions. And of course, Schedule 1 chemicals being the most dangerous chemicals, if you are handling those without a permit, you're in a lot of trouble in Australia because you certainly need a permit to carry out activities involving Schedule 1 activities, as well as, I think, Schedule 2 chemicals. They do have a Chemical Weapons Convention Office, of course, that's their national authority, and it's in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So in Vietnam, it's with Defense. In Australia, it's with Foreign Affairs and Trade. Again, this is to underline every country decides where they want their national authority to reside, and that is entirely up to the country. And they call their office the Australian Safeguards and Non-Proliferation Office. Okay, so let's go into the different types of weapon and related materials. So as a state party to this nuclear free zone treaty, and Vietnam, you'll recognize this, of course, because you also belong to a nuclear free zone treaty. They implement their obligations under a law by that name. This law is also where they have their safeguards measures and their additional protocol measures. Again, all for the purposes of non-proliferation of nuclear material. And they also define nuclear explosive device and weapons in that law. They criminalize activities involving nuclear explosive devices, of course. And like I said, they make reference to safeguards under their Nuclear Non-Proliferation Safeguards Act. So as you can see here, in their Nuclear Free Zone Treaty Act, they refer to their Nuclear Non-Proliferation Safeguards Act, which requires them to implement their safeguards and their additional protocol with the International Atomic Energy Agency. So it's a law referring to a law. That's how they've set it up. Okay, that brings us to the WMD Prevention Act. Became law in 1995, and its objective is to prohibit the supply and export of goods or services, so brokering as one example, that could assist in WMD programs. Reading through this law, because I was curious about it, of course, read through the whole thing, it is a catch-all law. So basically, if it's not a controlled good on a list, and Australia has lists, which we'll get to, it falls under this law. And if you are doing something in violation of this law, it's criminalized. So in other words, if you have a good intended for a weapons of mass destruction program, and you have that intent, but it's not on a list, that law will still criminalize that activity. That's why I call this a catch-all law. I don't know if the Australian government would agree with this characterization, but that's what it looks like to me. Okay, so under Section 9, there are a number of offenses. And again, it's all about suspicions that something might be used in a WMD program. It's done without a permit. The Minister of Defense hasn't said to you, it's okay to export that good. Those become criminal activities. And under Section 13, there's a requirement to apply for a permit to engage in these activities, if there's a possibility that they could be used in a WMD program. And again, these are not necessarily goods that are listed. These are goods that you think might be used in a WMD program. And so as an act of caution and due diligence, you request a permit from the Minister of Defense. A little complicated, but it's a catch-all. Then, to make things even more interesting, they have the Defense Trade Controls Act, the DTCA from 2012. And this is where you get into the lists. This law regulates, they call it dealings in items listed in, and I put inter alia part 2 because this is like the Philippines law. It's not just their WMD related activities, it's also, this is their conventional weapons law as well. So in that sense, it's like Philippines STMA. Part 2 of that list, so they have these lists, is relevant because it covers dual use goods and technologies. And there are the categories right there of relevance well, all of them are relevant, but I highlight 0, which is nuclear materials, facilities, and equipment. Category 1, this is your chemicals, microorganisms, toxins. And when it comes to delivery systems, categories 7 and 9 for navigation, avionics, aerospace, and propulsion. If you've ever looked at the EU list, Australia's list looks like the EU list. From the most recent directive from the EU is 821 from 2021. And those categories are extremely similar because they capture nuclear suppliers group, Australia group for chemical and biological materials and equipment. It captures Wassenaar, and it captures missile technology regime control regime. Thank you. I always mess that up. The MTCR. Okay, this act is so complex, it hurts to read through it. I'm going to just give you an outline because it is truly very. It's almost 200 pages. So I'm just going to give you a very broad outline. Part 2 of the act gives you the offenses related to this is the dual use goods list, permits for the purposes of the dual use goods list, notices from the Minister of Defense saying you can't carry out certain activities on that dual use goods list. And that could be country specific. You can't export X good to Y country. That's the idea behind that. And it also requires brokers to register if they're involved with supplying dual use goods on those lists. Part 3 and 4, this is, in my view, not relevant. It's a treaty. It's treaty implementation. Australia has a special relationship on dual use goods trade with the US. Not relevant, in my view, to this discussion. But under Part 5, the Secretary of the Department of Defense, this is in Australia, can request information or documents. Under Part 6, permit holders have to keep records. And the Secretary can require information from those records. This is pretty standard. Most countries would have something like that. Okay. So then that brings us to these regulations, and this is under their Customs Act. So Regulation 13 sub E to sub EK controls the export of military and dual use goods and technology from Australia. Like I said, they do conventional plus WMD. This is how they've chosen to do it. So they've got it together. Under Regulation 13E, the export of goods and technology is prohibited without a permit. And there are criteria in that regulation, and I'll include this in the package, by the way, that I give to you. They have several criteria, including Criterion 9, which is about weapons of mass destruction. And then 13E, there are some exceptions to export control, whereas the other regulations EB to ED are about applications, permit conditions, and revocation. It is a very complex system, but this is how they do it, and it works for them. And that is it. So come on, but I'm happy to take questions now about Australia.